Resuming debate, the Honourable Official Opposition Leader.
Madam Speaker, the Bloc is in a crisis. They have an identity crisis going. They're pulling in two irreconcilable differences. On the one hand, the Bloc claims to be independentist. They want to finally do away with the federal government's control over the Quebec nation and the lives of Quebecers. But then, according to their leader, the Bloc is a social democratic party, a progressive party, and the federal government is controlling with huge taxes, deficits, red tape, programs, subsidies, industrial subsidies, and so on. So the federal government has its tentacles everywhere. And although I don't share the Bloc's goals of sovereignty and socialism, in the National Assembly, both can be put forward at the same time. In Quebec City, separation from the federal government with the and the government of Quebec could then be social safety net, providential government. That would make sense in Quebec City, but it doesn't make sense here. The Bloc is not a Quebec party, a provincial party. They're a federal party here in the federal government in Ottawa. So they're part of the federal apparatus. So more money for the federal government leaves less money in the hands of Quebecers. And each taxpayer dollar spent in Ottawa is $1 less for the government in Quebec City or for Quebec taxpayers. And I'm not the one saying this. It's Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon who said so. According to his calculations, Quebecers pay $82 billion to Ottawa in taxes. So most of their taxes, eventually, that money makes its way back to Quebecers in child benefits or benefits for seniors or transfers for social services received by the government in Quebec City. But according to this expert, there's even more money that never goes back to Quebecers. Where does it go? Where does that money go? It goes to budgetary appropriations. Budgetary appropriations, that's money that's voted, that's passed in Ottawa to fund bureaucracy, consultants, interest groups, and so on. In other words, the big federal monster in Ottawa. And that's what independentists want to separate from. So one would think that an independence party would vote against all budgetary appropriations that feed the beast, that feed this monster, the federal beast. But no, as a matter of fact, ever since the Bloc arrived in the federal government in 2019, ever since the Bloc leader, he has voted every time in favor of the budgetary appropriations of this prime minister. He has voted over 200 times for $500 billion in extra federal spending. That's virtually the equivalent of Quebec's GDP, $500 billion, half $1 trillion. And that was not money that was going to old age security or health care. That money is already covered in legislation, so it didn't have to be voted on. No, the Bloc voted for these budgetary appropriations going to the central apparatus, the big federal machine. They voted to double spending on private consultants, $21 billion or $1,104 for each Quebec family going to federal consultants. And they also voted in favor of $25 million going to ArriveCan, even though the feds promised that it would only cost $80,000 for that app. So $65 million instead of $80,000. I find this fascinating for a so-called independence party from Quebec. They never voted in favor of reducing the cost of the federal government, the cost to Quebec taxpayers. They've never voted against any taxes levied by the federal government. One would have thought that a pro-independence party would vote against all these things, but no. They have actually taken a stand in favor of radically increasing taxes. They voted in favor of C11, which gives the CRTC, a federal agency, fuller control over what Quebecers can see and create on social media. And the same thing with their support for Radio-Canada is paradoxical. They have voted in favor of the merger of the CBC and Radio-Canada, which would basically take the radio out of Radio-Canada. And so obviously they're supporting, they must feel that the federal government and the federal public broadcaster is essential. But the question is, how would a sovereign Quebec led by the Bloc be any different than Canada led by the current Prime Minister? They voted in favor of higher taxes, more bureaucracy that meddles in everything but is good at nothing. The Bloc supports the justice system that frees repeat offenders and would crack down on hunting weapons. An independent Quebec under the Bloc leader would be almost identical to the federal government currently led by the current Prime Minister. Luckily for the Bloc, these fantasies of a providential state have already been realized under the current Prime Minister in Ottawa, with higher taxes, more regulations, more red tape, everyone dependent on the federal government, and the same kind of left-wing ideologies are the same for everyone. This is a dream for the Bloc, but it's a nightmare for Quebecers. More homelessness, more drug addiction, more hopelessness. Neither the Bloc leader is neither in favor of autonomy for Quebecers. What the Bloc wants is a more expensive government, just like the Liberals. The Bloc and the Liberals, the Liberal Bloc coalition is not an independence party. They're a dependence party. They're pro-dependency. They defend what they depend on. The Bloc depends on the federal government for its pensions, for their pensions and for their paychecks. They're dependent on the federal government. The Bloc could not exist without the federal government. But the common sense conservatives will cut taxes, invest more in housing than in bureaucracy. We will fix the budget, and we will cut waste. In other words, laissez-faire, a small central government, would allow Quebecers to do what they need to do to decide for themselves. And we will leave more money in the pockets of Quebecers, and they can decide whether or not they want to send more taxes to the government in Quebec City. But under the Conservative government, and this is a message to Quebecer, the Liberal Bloc coalition is master in your home. But with the common sense Conservatives, Quebecers will be masters in their own home. Thank you very much.